Now this shows a graph between historical graph between life expectancy and menopausal age. Now if you look at the chart historically, most women actually died before menopause. In other words, the end of her reproductive life normally meant the actual end of her actual life. So if you look at it, before 1900, most women lived to be about 40 to 45 years old and never reached menopause. But after 1900, you can see that the decoupling of hormones in menopause and her life expectancy grew leaps and bounds. After this crossover, her life was no longer linked to her reproductive capability. Now in history, before the modern era, women rarely got to menopause. In other words, when her reproductive hormones shut down, her reproductive organs shut down, she was normally dead also. But something happened in our modern era in the 20th century to delink or decouple her reproductive life with her actual life. So as we can see, for this chart, the dawn of the 20th century started the spread of the gap between life expectancy and a woman's hormones. So that led me to find out what culture might or might not have to do with it. But to start, we're going to review a little bit. If you want to see the longer version, you can go back to MGTOW and culture in an earlier video. But what culture actually is a mechanism to fulfill human needs and potentials. So when we started at the base, when we were first came out as animals, we satisfied our animal needs: food and water, water and shelter. Then as we developed and we moved up the chain, we got into things like safety for the group, security. And as we grew and we developed social, social instruments or cultural instruments to satisfy our social needs, so on and so forth: marriage, family, the village, cities, what have you. And then as you can see, as we go up higher and higher, we get into what the intellectual needs. Here's another chart talking about, breaking down the same thing we just saw in Maslow's with different categories. Like I said, if you want to break down these categories, you want to know more, go back to an earlier video. Now, we've established that culture is an instrument to satisfy human potentialities or human needs, and that culture acts as a insulator or a buffer zone between us, human beings, and the natural world, or our natural environment, or our physical reality. Like human beings, like the human beings through culture modify or affect its natural environment by, building houses, cutting down forests, killing animals, draining swamps, that kind of thing. By the same token, your natural environment affects your culture, and your culture affects human beings because it's a social heritage that's passed down from one person to another. So it's almost a feedback loop. Here's a diagram for you evolutionary biologists or pseudo-evolutionary biologists like Stardust and Barbar. This is the feedback loop where evolution, which is the adaptation to your natural environment, affects genes. Now, this genes, which quickly calls human potentialities, added to culture or the experiences or learned experiences from other human beings or other human personalities, develops an actual human personality, which is the current organism. Now, the current organism and the current situation or current physical environment add together to cause a behavior. Now, this behavior is the feedback loop. It affects the evolution and how the genes express themselves over a long period of time, but this is how the loop works. Now, here's the chart that we looked at in the other video. Now, as in the last video, we noticed that testosterone peaks about the age of 21 or 22, levels out, and then starts to fall or is falling at age 35. Now, by the time a man is in his 50s, I don't have the chart, but a man has lost half of his free testosterone, and he is starting what some people call andropause. In other words, he's not making enough testosterone to stay virile. And if you look at it, that almost correlates with a woman's menopause. So this was a heads up to me that there's something going on. There's something that has to do with human beings' hormones and their lifespan. Here's another chart that correlates some of the same things. You know, when you see all these charts line up or all these graphs line up around the same point, there's got to be something to it. Now, a woman's fertility peaks almost at the same point, from her early teens into her 30s, and at 35 rapidly starts to decline. And when she gets closer to 50, she's starting menopause, as we saw in a previous chart. So this mirrors closely to what men go through. So if it mirrors what men go through, there has to be a common denominator between the two. So we have to look further to find out what that is. Like I said, this crossover point, this age crossover point right here, almost mirrors what we call andropause in men. So it got me to looking at the historical average life expectancy of human beings. And this was an eye-opener. Like to say, at the dawn of humanity, the average life expectancy was that of primates in the wild, about 15 years. As we move up to prehistoric age, we gain 5 years, but we're still in our own in a natural environment. We only lived, where the life expectancy was only about 20 years old. I don't know whether it's because there wasn't enough food or wild animals or what, but the life expectancy of a human being back in prehistoric age was only about 20 years. Now, in the agricultural age, where we settled down, we started to grow our own food, and we have more protection from wild animals in the natural environment. We gained, 7 more years, and we lived to be about 28. Now, if you look at this right here at the prehistoric age, this, next to the charts of when men's testosterone peaks, it peaks at what? 21, 22, 23 years old. Look at that. Prehistoric age, your natural environment. You have to reproduce before you die. So your hormones will go into overdrive to reproduce. Or that's my conclusion. So you would naturally expect that your biology would push you to reproduce right in that range. Very interesting. Agricultural age changes a bit. You live a little longer. Your hormones are in sync, but this is when the crossover starts. Industrial age. People live to be 35 years old. Still within range, but now people start to outlive the peak of their hormones. So now you don't quite, you're actually dead before you get to andropause. You're actually dead before your virility is gone. But you get closer to that peak, your useful peak as far as reproduction. And here we get to the modern age, where the average life expectancy is 67 years old, way past the age of peak reproduction. Here's a chart of lifespans and how the culture, or people's culture, and their revolutions, or what they call their practices, their culture, started to change and affect lifespans, started to change their physical environment. And you can see the impact, the changing of the physical environment, such as the ability to grow food, the ability to use other things other than human labor to actually grow food for survival. You can see the impact on the more food you had, the longer you live. So now this is when people went from 28 years old to 35, because now they're using different practices. It takes less people to actually grow food, a little bit more leisure, so now you live longer. Then we get to the Industrial Revolution, where we're actually using steam and machines rather than brute strength and human labor. So now that pushes the age up to 40. well past well past the peak of your reproductive age. That's just as we see with the women, we see the delinking between our reproduction, our reproductive peak, and our lifespan. We're living almost twice as long. Here's the same thing. Before 1850 or before 1850, before the industrial age, you only lived to be about 35. And as you get to the petroleum age, or you get to the modern era, it almost your age or life expectancy doubles, and it's still going. It's still rising. So what does that say about how our culture shifts? And the previous chart, you looked at how culture affected our physical environment first, and if our physical environment affected our physiology to where we could, quote unquote, live past our normal lifespans, or in essence past the design the factory of the design lifespan. In other words, our bodies were basically built to live between 28 and 35 years. And because of our culture, because of the machines, because of the lifestyles, because of the interactivity, we now live to be 70. So now we looked at the charts. How has that changed? The change in material culture affected our internal culture. In other words, the way we actually do things, the way we actually behave. Now, in the past, if you look at our culture, our normal culture, our agricultural age culture, when do men start taking care of children? When do men start to reproduce and take care of children? According to his lifespan, you would expect it to be right after adulthood, when a man is at his hormonal and possibly physical peak, which is the age of 21, because he had to do hard labor. It was a lot of hard labor to take care of a family, a lot of hard labor to take care or tend to and raise children. So his peak and his marriage peak would be what? Here. Because at 30, 35, he might not be alive. And definitely at 40, he was dead. He could no longer reproduce. He could no longer take care of children. And this is 1960, halfway through our modern age. But you can see how slowly culture has changed this behavior. So now, since we've been living longer and our lifespan is 67 and not 35 or 40, where this would be the midpoint of our life. In one half we're young, the other half we're old, and here, more than likely, back in the day, back in history, we'll most likely be dead. That'd be the end of our lifespan. This blue line represents our natural or our unaltered lifespan. But since the modern age, enhances our environment, enhances and lengthens our lifespan, that midway point changes. And the curve is starting to reflect that midpoint. Like you saw, the average age for a man to live is 67 years old. So if you look at this distribution age for a first time marriage, instead of the midway point being about 21 years old, 21, 22 years old, it is now almost 30. So it's catching up. Culture is now starting to catch up and reflect our physical reality. Not quite our biological reality, but our physical reality. It's shifting. So now a man, instead of getting married at 21, he's getting married at 28, 29, even 30. So now this, around 30, becomes his midway point, because that closer relates. This curve closer relates to his lifespan. Whereas this was the normal agricultural age lifespan, this becomes his industrial age lifespan. So now the physical reality, culture changes the physical reality first. It changes the behavioral culture or reality second. And then what lags, and it still lags, it takes a long time because evolution changes quite slowly. Whereas our age lifespan reflects our cultural change, our biology still reflects what we were like 2,000, maybe even 5,000 years ago. Where does our andropause or our drop starts? Where would it start? It would start right around here, right around 35 years old. So our biology is still 2,000 to 3,000 years, maybe even 5,000 years behind our cultural or our physical reality. So that will reflect marriage, that reflects what women actually do, that reflects a lot of the cultural changes that we see as far as children, reproducing children, the cost benefits and whatnot. In other words, our bodies are still responding. Our bodies are still responding to what our environment or our physical reality was 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. So that affects our emotions. So this it's basically a battle between our biology, the feelings that our biology causes, your testosterone, your estrogen, progesterone, and whatnot, as far as physical changes, and the physical reality of your environment, the lengthening of lifespan, drugs, to cause virility a little bit longer. In other words, there's a fight. So there's also an emotional fight. We actually live longer. We actually outlive the original specifications of what our genes say that we're supposed to live. So basically, this has only been happening in the last 100 years. Our culture, our cultural behavior is catching up. It hasn't caught up completely yet, but it's catching up. It's catching up to the new reality. The new rules are being written for the new reality. The old rules, marriage, dating, courtship, having children, families, are just now starting to reflect what the new reality is. It's still behind our physical reality. And our gene expressions, how we feel, our emotional insides that are affected by our biologies, by our chemistry, are still way behind. So I thought this would be an interesting subject to bring up. This is food for thought. Comment, post another video, whatever. Let's keep the discussion going.